Hello. In this video, I would like to build up a bit of a theoretical framework for future work being done on this channel, and cover briefly some of the topics I hope to discuss in the future. I'm first going to touch on Marx's relation to Hegel, and the importance that Hegel has for Marx, specifically regarding the structure of Marx's magnum opus, Capital Volume 1, and how some concepts and categories Hegel uses in his Science of Logic can help us in understanding Marx and his critique of capitalism. Then, I will discuss Marx's opening of Capital, with specific attention paid to Marx's analysis of the value form and the category of capital. Then, I will briefly sketch Hegel's Science of Logic to add to the concept of capital that Marx builds. And then, in a comparison of Marx's Capital and Hegel's Science of Logic, I'm going to compare the two works with specific attention paid to Hegel's category of substance and how this category of substance as a category of totality can help us understand Marx's category of capital and how this can help us understand capitalism. Finally, with the rest out of the way, I will touch on what overcoming capitalism would actually have to accomplish, and briefly discuss the limitations of cooperatives, as an example of some of the shortcomings in some conceptions of so-called anti-capitalist politics that I see today. An important point of crossover between Marx and Hegel is their method of extrapolation. Hegel's magnum opus, the Science of Logic, which from this point I'm going to refer to as the Logic or Hegel's Logic, and Marx's own magnum opus, Capital Volume 1, share a homology in their structure of exposition. Chris Arthur would refer to this shared method of exposition as so-called systematic dialectic. Systematic dialectic is a method of extrapolation that attempts to work through and demonstrate a given whole via a meticulous, categorical working through of a given object. It does this by starting at an abstract starting point, which is an entry point into the system at large. The starting point is necessarily a rather violent abstraction from what we are actually trying to discuss. The abstraction is violent in this case because we must begin at a starting point so removed from our endpoint, but is necessarily removed so we can start somewhere, and start in such a way that we can unpack capitalism, or whatever object we're dealing with, from a given dynamic present within it at the starting point. The goal, then, is to unpack a given system from within its own internal logical structure. From our abstract starting point, dialectic works immanently through the given object, at each step expanding the information we have about the object and connecting past developments to current ones. Our starting category is not going to be left behind, but will constantly be restructured as the dialectic progresses. The final endpoint of the dialectic is the full extrapolation of a given totality, and this conception of a given totality holds each category that we have worked through in connection and demonstrates how each category is interdetermining in some fashion. Systematic dialectic is a method that necessarily is self-reflexive. Each categorical movement recontextualizes what has come before, and it constantly reinterrogates previous positions. Dialectic is also immanent, meaning that it remains firmly rooted within the object at hand and its internal logic. So, in summary, dialectic is a method of exposition where we attempt to look at the inner logic of a given object, immanently, or from within its own logical structure. We begin at an abstract starting point, which is our entrance into this system, and with each advance in the dialectic we add new categories and recontextualize old ones. The end result of our exposition is a picture of totality, a whole system in which we can see how all of our past developments interrelate and connect. This method of extrapolation is self-reflexive because it constantly reinterrogates what came before, and we will see how Hegel's logic and Marx's capital both share this dialectical exposition, and it is necessary to understand to have an adequate critique of capitalism. Such a nonlinear exposition is needed to grasp the interconnected nature of capitalism. We may say the exposition is spiral-like, and that, as Hegel says in the Science of Logic, quote, The whole of science is itself a circle in which the first also becomes the last, and the last also becomes the first. The beginning of philosophy is the ever-present and self-preserving foundation of all subsequent developments, remaining everywhere immanent in its further determinations. Now, I understand that this is all rather abstract, but it will hopefully become clear with further extrapolation in the two following examples of Hegel and Marx's work. Such abstractness is to an extent unavoidable. Marx and Hegel both remark that knowledge can only come from judging through the material at hand, and Marx and Hegel both discuss how there is, quote, no royal road to science. And as Marx states specifically in the preface to the French edition of Capital Volume 1, regarding this lack of such royal road, quote, only those who do not dredge the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. Or, as Hegel puts it in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, quote, the subject matter is not exhausted in its aims. Rather, it is exhaustively treated when it is worked out. The whole is a result together with the way the result comes to be. This is also to say this channel and the videos I hope to put out are no substitute for reading the materials at hand. You may find you believe I am wrong, and I encourage disagreements and corrections. I hope to spread knowledge from some of these thinkers and even throw my own hat into the ring, but YouTube is no substitute for reading these works themselves. Now that we've looked a little bit at the general method Marx uses in his so-called mature critique, let's take a look at Marx's Capital itself. We'll go through a short gloss on the book, and we'll move a bit into Hegel's logic afterwards. We'll see how the whole system unfolds from an abstract starting point into an interconnected system. Marx's Capital is a systematic analysis and unpacking of capitalist society. Marx's goal is to work out its dynamics and structures and to show that the whole of capitalism is a totality, a full interconnected system that mutually presupposes itself, meaning that each part of its existence mutually requires and posits the other part for the whole of it to function. The whole system cannot be extrapolated at once. Instead, it requires careful and meticulous working through to demonstrate its inner logic. Thus, Marx must find an abstract starting point, a starting category, from which he can work through capitalism's structure. Marx picks the commodity as his starting point to introduce capitalism. It is, as he describes, the basic unit of capitalist society. The opening sentence of Capital makes clear that our object of analysis is from the very start capitalist society, and it's really important that we keep this in mind, as his method of extrapolation cannot always make this fact exceptionally clear. It is from this very early starting point that Marx is able to discuss what he sees as the dual structure of the commodity, which, as we will see with the dialectic unfolding, is equally a dual structure of capitalism more generally. This dual structure is an opposition between the commodity's use value and its value. Marx really begins with exchange value, but he quickly moves into value and later states value is what's really being discussed. The use value of a commodity is its material properties. Linen, for example, is something I can use to weave new clothes, which is relatively simple enough to grasp. The value of the commodity, however, is very unique and it's fundamentally social. It is not natural, unlike the commodity's use value. The value of the commodity is present only in the relationship between commodities in exchange. Value is essentially a social relation, and Marx has three aspects he attributes to it: its substance, its magnitude, and its form. The substance of value he calls abstract labor, which is, well, human labor in the abstract. But this process of abstraction, whereby labor and its products are treated as a homogeneous abstract quantity, is not something that the people involved in these relations do consciously, but it happens behind their backs, as Marx says. This process of abstraction occurs in exchange itself. It is a product of the social relation of exchange. The magnitude of value is measured in exchange by quantities of abstract labor as a social average. For example, if the average time needed to produce a coat in a society is 3 hours, then the value of that coat is 3 hours worth of abstract labor. Socially necessary labor time varies by society, productivity, and various other social contexts. Value, however, and its magnitude are not something that can be directly expressed itself, as it's fundamentally a relationship. Value then must appear in a form that is other than itself, or in a form of appearance, or a form of value, or a value form. So let's have a little recap. The commodity is our starting point of the dialectic. Remember that I stated at the start we needed an abstract entrance into the system, and the starting point has two oppositional features: its use value, its material qualities, and value, which is a sort of socially inscribed quality. The value exists in exchange between products in an exchange relation, and the exchange is what makes these products commodities. Value as a social relation has three aspects. It has magnitude, measured in the socially necessary labor time to produce a commodity, the substance of value, which is abstract labor, and the form of value, which we are now going to dig into a little deeper. From this early exposition of the commodity, Marx moves into the ways in which value must express itself, again in the form of appearance, or the value form, or the form of value, or however you want to phrase it. It's phrased in a couple different ways. Value has to fundamentally be expressed in something other than itself. It can't be expressed directly because value is fundamentally only a social relation. The expression of value and value's existence itself requires a commodity to be embedded in relations with other commodities. In this relation, the value of a commodity can be expressed only in some quantity of another thing. The value relation expresses itself then in an exchange value. And exchange value is the quantitative relation between two commodities as expressed in an amount of a given thing. The value of a coat, for example, in a direct relationship with another commodity, say yards of linen, can be expressed only in a quantity of that other commodity. So take, for example, the expression that 20 yards of linen equals one coat. This is an expression he uses all the time in the first chapter. In this expression of value, which Marx calls the simple form of value, value is shown to be relational between commodities. It can only be expressed in this relation. In this simple expression of value, two roles are discovered, that of the relative form of value and the equivalent form of value. The relative form of value is the commodity whose value is being expressed and measured. The equivalent form of value is the form in which the relative form of value is being expressed. In our expression that 20 yards of linen equals one coat, the 20 yards of linen play the role of the relative form of value, and the coat plays the role of the equivalent form of value. As commodities, they both have value, but the coat in the equivalent role only acts to express the value of the relative form in quantities of its own self. Hence, 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 40 yards of linen equals two coats, etc. In this way, the material use value of the equivalent form acts as the measure, the quantitative measure in which the value of the relative form is expressed. So, in summary, the value relation must express itself in a separate thing, a form of value, or the value form. Two commodities are brought into an exchange relation with each other and confront one another as quantities of value. But each commodity can only express itself indirectly. One commodity must play the role of the relative form of value, and their value is expressed in the other commodity, which plays the role of the equivalent form, which expresses the value of the relative form of value in quantities of itself. At this level of conceptual extrapolation, this is all quite abstract, and the exchange relation is quite abstract and very distinct from what you would actually see concretely. But dealing with it simply at a conceptual level, there's a problem that is present in this current relationship. The simple form of value is very limited. What about other commodities? Limit is kind of at play here, whereby exchange relations should be able to encompass all sorts of commodities, as value is necessarily a sort of homogenizing social quality. But each commodity is only measured at this stage in an ever-changing relationship of one specific commodity to another. Thus, there's a failure to adequately capture the universal nature of value This conceptual limitation requires a forward progression in the dialectical presentation, and as such, we have to move on to what Marx calls the expanded form of value. In the expanded form of value, our 20 yards of linen may equal any quantity of any other commodity. 20 yards of linen, for example, equals a coat, or 40 pounds of coffee equals one coat, or 20 pounds of tea equals a coat, etc. Here, a commodity is brought into relation with all other commodities in a somewhat more established way than the previous form, as now all commodities are recognized as commodities in exchange and relatable via value and via value relation. But what lacks here is any form of general equivalency between commodities that would ground all these possible exchange relations. While all commodities can play the role of either relative or equivalent form of value, nothing is set or standard. Such a situation is still highly limited. Thus, we find another conceptual shortcoming. The resolution of this shortcoming is found in what Marx calls the general form of value, our next conceptual development. In the general form of value, all commodities express their values in a single commodity, which plays the role of what we'll call, or what Marx calls, the universal equivalent. This universal equivalent acts essentially as the direct and independent expression of exchange value. The values of the commodity measure themselves in quantities of this universal equivalent. If, for example, we have a coat, and our coat is the universal equivalent, we can state that 20 yards of linen, 40 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of tea, or 20 tons of iron are each individually equivalent to one coat. All commodities in this situation express and measure their values in quantities of that single commodity that acts as the universal equivalent. The universal equivalent is socially recognized, and it holds this special status. This is very quickly moving us into a quite familiar thing. That would be money. But I would first like to take note, before we move on to the money form, that Marx makes a very specific and important statement in the development of the general form of value. And I will add this here because we are essentially already operating at the level of money in the general value form. It is with money, a universal equivalent, that commodities appear to each other as values. This is because within the establishment of a general equivalent, all commodities are measured by a universal thing. Hence, money, or the generalized expression of value, plays an enormously important role in Marx's account. Marx states that, with this form, quote, commodities are, for the first time, really brought into relation with each other as values, or permitted to appear to each other as exchange values. Value must appear in a form of appearance, which is to say, it must appear in something other than itself. We can think of it as sort of inner logic, and its form of appearance being a material manifestation of that inner logic. A somewhat analogous situation would be gender. Gender itself is a social relation, but it appears, typically, in two independent modes of expression, male and female. For value, money plays the role of the form of appearance. Because value is only a social relation between commodities, these commodities must express this relation quantitatively in a third thing, in this case, exchange value. This exchange value is the form of appearance of value. The money form is the final development of Marx's analysis of the value form in Chapter 1 of Capital. The money form is the form in which value both expresses itself fully and actualizes itself. It is with money, all commodities are truly brought into relation with each other, as values, because each can recognize its own value in a shared thing, that being money, the universal equivalent, and in such they have a shared common measurement and shared expression of their inner logic. All commodities express their value in this shared universal equivalent. Marx, in the first edition of the German edition of Capital, has a quote that expresses this relationship well. Quote, "It is as if, alongside an external to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form when grouped together the various kinds of species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, there existed also in addition the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom. Such a particular, which contains within itself all really present species of the same entity, is a universal, like animal, God, etc. As such, all commodities, as the dual bearers of use value and value, are particulars, brought into a genuine relationship with money. Commodities that have heterogeneous use values and a homogeneous socially imbued value are subsumed under the universal value form of money, which these commodities all relate to as their expressor and measure of value. This is to say that because all commodities as values must express their values in a third thing, exchange value or the value form, with money acting as the general expression of value, money acts as a universal expression of each particular commodity's value, which is reflected back onto the commodities. Money is the universal commodity, and as such, it is the direct incarnation of value itself. It should also be noted that the original contradiction which exists within commodities, that being between use value and value, is now expressed externally between the commodities as use values and money as the universal value form, which reflects the values of the commodities back onto the products, hence again the importance that money plays here. So let's sum up where we've been so far. In an exchange relation, products take on the social form of commodities. They have use values and values. The relative form of value expresses itself in quantities of the use value of the equivalent form of value. This relation begins simply between two commodities, conceptually, in the simple form of value, but via various conceptual limitations, it must expand and develop to eventually reach the money form of value. Conceptual limitations emerge which require a general equivalent to come forward, so the money form develops. With the money form, all commodities express their values in a shared equivalent form of value, and their values are expressed through money in quantities of money or as prices. The values of commodities are thus reflected back onto the commodities through the money form. So now that we've gone over the development of the value form, let's take a look at how Marx continues to develop the exchange relation. Value is an emergent social substance from exchange relations. It presents itself as a social substance that maintains itself in exchange. Marx uses the abstract construct of so-called simple circulation to explain this exchange. In the movement of an exchange between two commodities, one commodity metamorphosizes into money and then back into another commodity. The movement is represented as CMC, or the movement of commodity into money back into commodity. In this movement, the same value is maintained throughout. The value undergoes a metamorphosis, and it changes its form. With the purchase of the second commodity, the transition of money back into the commodity, the seller consumes his commodity and drops out of exchange. From the movement of CMC, Marx turns his analysis with the development of the three functions of money. Money as measure of value, an ideal price. Money as medium of circulation, stepping in and moving, quote-unquote, in between commodities as a necessary step of exchange. And finally, money as an independent incarnation of exchange value. It is with this final stage that money can move into capital. As an independent form of wealth, money can step outside of circulation and stand in as exchange value incarnate. But exchange value standing alone does nothing but sit around. Perhaps it even depreciates in value. Money in its third form as independent exchange value thus exists in a contradiction with itself. It is qualitatively considered independent of all limits. It represents material wealth because it is directly convertible into all possible commodities. At the same time, it is limited only quantitatively. As Marx writes, quote, "Qualitatively or formally considered, money is independent of all limits. That is, it is the universal representative of material wealth, because it is directly convertible into any other commodity. But, at the same time, every actual sum of money is limited in amount, and therefore has only a limited efficacy as a means of purchase." It is in this contradiction that Marx moves into his concept of capital. Capital is the movement of value from a simple substance that vanished when a circuit of exchange had finished, that being the movement of CMC, into a self-moving subject. Here, the original circuit of CMC is inverted. It now acts as MCM, or money into commodity back into money. The goal of exchange moves from a simple exchange of commodities to a movement of invested value, whose goal is the further accumulation of itself. Here, money thus acts as a social relation that has an immanent goal within itself, to maintain and expand its own quantitative amount. This conceptually overcomes the above self-imposed limit. Value, starting as money, can become a process in which it autonomously expands itself. Marx says that capital becomes a, quote, self-moving substance which passes through a process of its own, and for which commodities and money are both mere forms. In doing this, it acts as the quote-unquote dominant subject of a process that changes its forms between money and commodities as needed to pursue its own valorization. Thus, as has been developed, we find at the heart of capitalism Marx's category of capital, as value whose purpose is to maintain itself and to quantitatively expand itself. It sits as the subject of this relation and the movement of capitalism. By subject, I mean the dominant force and process at play. It is this category of capital that is essential to understand and to which we will return to later on. For now, we will continue our development of capital. Capital, even though it has arisen out of exchange, cannot exist only in exchange. Marx assumes the equivalent exchange of commodities, and as such, capital reaches a contradiction. It cannot exist within circulation nor outside of it, it must be in both. Thus, it is here that capital is introduced as a social process that involves the sale and purchase of labor power, which is the capacity of humans to do work as it appears as a commodity under capitalism. Note here how our category of commodity has extended beyond its original introduction. This labor power, like any commodity, is a use value and a value. Its value is the socially necessary labor time for its production, the cost of the means of subsistence to maintain it. Or, in simpler terms, this means the stuff the workers have to buy in order to live. This is socially and historically determined, and increases if the skill for the labor power is greater, but all value is assumed to be measured in simple labor. Its use value is the ability to create products or carry out services, but fundamentally to create value. Capital must thus purchase access to labor power in exchange. This conceptually moves us into the realm of production. It is in production that capital self-grounds itself, and subsumes labor as a means of its own self-valorization. Or, in other words, capital incorporates the labor process as its own measure and source of itself, and uses labor as a means for creating more value to quantitatively expand itself. The book continues from this point to demonstrate the ways in which capital subsumes or incorporates into itself the production process, labor, products, and society at large under itself. Commodities, for example, which were our abstract starting point, are recontextualized as generalized social forms that all products take on in capitalist society. Furthermore, the dual contradiction within the commodity, use value and value, shows itself to be one that runs throughout capitalism. Labor both produces products and acts as a means for capital's self-valorization, i.e. the production of value. The production process is both at once a material process of production and a process of valorization. We also gain insight into how capital reshapes social relations and social organization. Capital takes over historically pre-capitalist forms of organization and reshapes them to itself, eventually producing machinery and industry, which Marx describes as the form of fixed capital adequate to capital. Capital is thus at the heart of modern society. It is a category of totality, which subsumes society under itself as moments of its own self-reproduction. Capital, or value in process, is a self-moving force to which society is subordinate. It is a social relation and social structure which is beyond the control of those under it. The relations of production control the producers, not the other way around. The social force dominates not only workers, but constrains capitalists too. They must continue to compete amongst themselves and strive for greater efficiency. They must produce so as to be profitable, as an unprofitable capitalist is not a capitalist for long. Capitalist totality, with capital at its heart, is a semi-autonomous social structure that dominates those under it. Capital imposes, quote, the rule of things over man, of dead labor over the living, of the product over the producer. Thus, at the level of material production, of the life process in the realm of the social, we find the inversion of subject into object, and vice versa. The theory of capital shows itself to be vital for any understanding of capitalism, because it grasps the social relations that capitalism is based around. As such, it is necessary for any critique or attempts to overcome capitalism to grasp capital as a category of totality that dominates those who produce it and controls their activity. Now that I have briefly attempted to run through the entire lay of the land regarding Marx's Capital Volume 1, I'm now going to turn to Hegel's Science of Logic to illustrate some similarities in the structure of Hegel's work and Marx's work, and how Hegel's concept of substance can help us understand Marx's category of capital. Hegel's Science of Logic is a systematic ontology. It is Hegel's full extrapolation of his system of being and its development into concept. In it, Hegel attempts to unpack a structure of reality. My extrapolation of Hegel here will be much less dense than my extrapolation of Marx's Capital, and it's really intended to be more of a gloss to demonstrate the similarities between Marx and Hegel, and how Hegel can help us think about capitalism. Hegel's extrapolation of his dialectic begins actually quite similar to Marx's, between a contradiction between two categories that will run through the whole system. Those two categories are those of being and nothing. It shows that these two categories only have meaning and determination in relation to each other, similar to how value only is when it takes material forms of use value, i.e., when the two categories exist in opposition to each other. From this starting point, the whole of Hegel's ontology is unfolded. Being and nothing maintain their relevance as structure and categories throughout the logic. Much like Marx's categories, they are recontextualized and take on different meanings, and in this become increasingly concrete, i.e., less abstract. From these categories, Hegel moves on to complete his conception of being for itself, being which becomes self-contained and self-moving. From here, Hegel moves into essence as a sort of so-called inner logic of being, or being reflected into itself. Essence is itself a reflection of being, or as he puts it, being with itself. Once it is worked out, essence must appear. And from here, essence concretizes itself into appearance, concrete existence, and eventually actuality. Essence and being are shown to necessarily require each other, and to act as two parts of the same thing, substance or the absolute. The section on substance is an important section of the book, as what is demonstrated is the culmination of the objective logic, which is the first part of the science of logic. It is from the vantage point of substance that we see that all categorical moves made up until this point are themselves moments of substance, self-movement, and self-emergence. The various categories discussed and unpacked thus far in the book have led to a concrete totality of an ontological system, which has subsumed all previous moments into itself. Being and nothing still retain their relevance, but have become restructured. The category of nothing is the negative self-movement of substance, and the category of being are substance's positive qualities. Substance is thus a totality, which is taken in all previous developments as part of itself, all particular moments of an overriding substance. In this way, there is a similarity between Marx's beginning with the contradiction of the commodity, use value and value, which we saw ran through the whole of capitalism, and being and nothing in Hegel, which Hegel at the beginning of the logic describes as the most abstract definition of the absolute, or substance. The second part of Hegel's logic is titled the subjective logic, and in it, Hegel situates subjective conceptual thought. I will be very brief here and simply state that what is shown throughout is that subjective thought is itself part of, embedded in, and constituted by substance. It is a self-conscious part of substance. Substance is shown to thus be self-acting, self-moving subject. It is both structure and agent. It's a systematic totality which holds each part of itself as necessarily and determinately connected with each other part. It is the brief sketch of both of these works that I have laid out that serves as the basis for linking the two concepts of capital and substance together. Both have a similar categorical purpose in their respective works. They are both categories of totality. They encompass the heart at the center of each system. In Hegel's logic, one finds the absolute, or substance, at the center. It is the totality of being, and simultaneously the most basic and complex part of the ontology. All things are within it, moments of it, and all things are composed of it. Through the various stages of being, and various finite beings, the concepts, and the subjective thoughts, lies substance. For Hegel, this turns out to be a rather glorious conclusion. The end of the book, in fact, is the reconciliation of the subjective and objective position. Conscious thought is found to be the thinking part of substance, a moment in this larger totality. For Marx, on the other hand, such substance at the heart of capitalism has nothing glorious about it. Where Hegel finds a rational structure to reality, Marx in capitalism finds what is equivalent to a Lovecraftian horror. The notion of totality built up in both works is vital, especially regarding our understanding of capitalism. More common understandings of Marx may hold his theory of exploitation to be vital, which it is. Please don't misunderstand my point. Or they may emphasize the role of class in capitalist society, which is also vital. But what is really vital for a proper critique of capitalism is a critique of value and capital as socially structuring categories. Capitalism isn't just a loose set of social and class relations. Each part of capitalism's whole is mutually reinforcing and self-reproducing, and all parts center around capital as a category of totality. Commodities are produced for the sake of accumulating capital. Wage labor, and hence class relations which manifest through it, is a relation built around capital self-movement. Things like money and commodities, as the generalized form of product, and the form labor takes under capitalism, serve as moments of capital. The whole capitalist society is subordinated to the social movement of capital. Capitalism thus forms a systematic totality, each moment of which is fundamentally oriented around the social relation of capital. Marx writes in the Grundrisse, quote, "Capital is value relating to itself as value in every one of the moments of its metamorphosis, in which it appears at one time as money, at another time as commodity, then again as exchange value, then again as use value. Capital is thus posited as value in process, which is capital in every moment. Capitalism posits itself as a semi-autonomous, objective social structure beyond the control of any group of people. Other societies in history form coherent wholes as well, but in contrast to a system like, say, feudalism, for example, where the social relations are based on overt personal relations of domination, capitalism is instead built on a system of abstract social domination, where the social structures themselves are independent of any control by any group. This is why the focus on class relations alone is not sufficient. The capitalist class itself is subordinate to this structure. Production must be mediated through the form of a capitalist firm, and that firm must abide by the structural imposition placed on it by value and capital. A firm must produce products for sale, and must turn a profit in selling these products. An unprofitable firm is, in fact, not a firm for long. Furthermore, capitalists are forced to keep up, in a sense. In their structural compulsion to maintain profitability, they necessarily must continuously employ new means for increasing productivity, be that new machinery, methods of labor discipline and control, new applications of science and technology, etc. Capitalism thus finds itself as a society that is situated under an abstract social domination. Capitalism thus imposes certain forms of specific social necessity on the producers. Production is not carried out fundamentally for the purpose of fulfilling human needs, but instead for the accumulation of capital. This is no moral fault of any actor. It is a structural compulsion over the situated in the system. This also, and here again this links to Hegel's substance, provides a theory of contextualized subjective agency, as being constituted and shaped by social conditions, and I hope to expand on this point in a future video, but will not at the moment. We thus see that capital plays a similar totalizing role in Marx's systematic account of capitalism as Hegel's substance does in his logic. It is a category which is at the heart of the system, and around which all moments and categories exist as moments of this central category. The orientation of production towards value and capital also relates to the original contradiction found in the commodity. Remember that the contradiction runs through the whole of capitalism, that being between use value and value. Use value acts as the vessels for value, but value plays the dominant role. Shoes, coats, etc. are produced not because they fulfill needs, which they certainly do, but this fulfillment is secondary to the operation of capital as an autonomous social process. Capitalism thus also presents itself as a society which is capable of producing a far greater amount of material wealth, i.e. use values, than any other society previously. It is capable of reducing the amount of work which needs to be done in a society to ensure a high standard of material wealth. But at the same time, because these materially useful products are side effects and not the prime function of production under the society, all possible generations of free time are subordinated to capital as more time to produce profit. All possible advancements and gains in an abundance of material wealth are subordinated to capital's drive to accumulation. Science and technology are also fundamentally subordinated to a social process which orients itself around its own endless accumulation first and foremost. Capital thus presents itself as a social process that produces huge potentials for free time and material abundance, but is equally structurally incapable of realizing those potentials. I quote Marx here, quote, "Capital itself is the moving contradiction, in that it professes to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time, on the other hand, as the sole means and source of wealth. Hence, it diminishes labor time in the necessary form so as to increase it in the superfluous form, hence posits superfluous in the growing measure as a condition for the necessary." This understanding of capital and value, which I have only sketched here, is fundamental for both the critique of capitalism, but also for understanding what overcoming capitalism would have to entail. From the framework I have attempted to present above, it is important to understand that capitalism is not defined just by the existence of a formal capitalist class. Capitalism is above all historically unique, in that it is a system of relations that constitutes an autonomous social structure above the control of any group of people. Capitalism isn't just found in the existence of a capitalist class, but in the existence of capital, value, wage labor, and the production of commodities, and the generalized form of commodities, money, etc. The emphasis on capital and value are vital, insofar as they express categories of totality. Furthermore, all of the above can exist without the formal existence of a capitalist class. Political ends, thus, need to be oriented to a fundamental overcoming of capitalist social relations, not simply their redistribution and changes in certain formalities. A popular trend we can see today amongst the anti-capitalist left is an emphasis on worker cooperatives. While this may be a way that would be preferable to make the current order more bearable, it also does not fundamentally break with the capitalist mode of production. Imagine a cooperative, which has its nice democratic meetings every week to decide the affairs of the firm. It has a greater degree of democratic control, yes, but what is it still operating under? It is still above all a capitalist firm, a business that must produce profit in order to remain competitive amongst all other firms. We can imagine, for example, that all firms in this hypothetical society are cooperatives. All the workers are still compelled to produce and work for this firm under the structural compulsion of wage labor. The firm is still oriented towards the production of commodities to sell, as it is structured around capital accumulation, and still engages in money relations. At every step of the cooperative's existence, it still functions as a capitalist firm, and in every way is still structurally compelled to function in a capitalist manner. The same impulses of abstract social domination imposed on producers by the existing social structure are still present. The production of value still remains the dominant social driver. Overcoming capitalism, then, can not simply be defined by the self-management of workers. The question is always what is being self-managed. If communism is really, as Marx states in the German Ideology, the real movement to abolish the present state of things, it must be a movement which determinately negates capitalism. If value, capital, money, wage labor, etc. survive, then capitalism survives along with its abstract social domination. Only a society which consciously orients itself to the free development of all, to free time, and to the production of material wealth for the direct satisfaction of social needs, not as a byproduct for the production of value and the accumulation of capital, actually succeeds in overcoming capitalism. A society that simply restructures the present state of things, maintaining all social relations except abolishing a few formal conditions, has not succeeded in overcoming what it sought to. Capitalism isn't over when proletarians manage society. Capitalism is over when the proletariat as a class ceases to exist. Thus, the proletariat is only successful in its transformative task when it abolishes itself. Its movement must be a movement of self-negation, which takes all the muck of society with it. Communism is not about realizing that people are fundamentally good. Such questions of are humans good or bad are rather silly anyway. It is not a question of managing the distribution of the existing society in a different way. It is not about the state control over your life or any other common misunderstanding. Any genuinely emancipatory project must put humans and their free and full development at its center. Quote, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is wealth other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange? The full development of human mastery over the forces of nature, those of so-called nature as well as humanity's own nature. The absolute working out of his creative potentialities, with no presupposition other than the previous historical development, which makes this totality of development, i.e., the development of all human powers as such, the end in itself. Not as measured on a predetermined yardstick, where he does not reproduce himself in one specificity, but produces his totality, strives not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming.